The day I watched Margaret Whitmore tear down my grandfather's fence with a crowbar, I knew she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. What she didn't know was that beneath my lakefront property lay something that would turn her precious HOA rules into meaningless paper and transform my quiet cabin retreat into an impenetrable fortress she could never touch. My name is David, and this is the story of how one vengeful HOA president's obsession with control led me to discover a century-old legal loophole that would change everything. By the time you hear what I found buried in those dusty courthouse records, you'll understand why Margaret went from wielding a sledgehammer to begging me for mercy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the morning I inherited my grandfather's lake cabin. Thought I'd finally found peace. 3 years ago, when my grandfather passed away at 92, he left me the most precious thing he owned, a small log cabin on the shores of Lake Harmony, about 2 hours north of Denver. Grandpa Joe had built that cabin with his own hands in 1962, back when the area was nothing but wilderness and dreams. I'll never forget the first time I walked through that creaky front door as the new owner. The smell of old cedar and wood smoke still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of the lavender my grandmother used to grow in window boxes. Every corner held a memory: the fishing rods still propped by the door, his favorite reading chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun over the water. The cabin sat on just under 2 acres of pristine lakefront property, surrounded by towering pines and connected to the water by a gentle slope that Grandpa had carefully terraced over the decades. It wasn't fancy: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting, but it was perfect. Most importantly, it was mine. After 20 years in corporate marketing, dealing with endless meetings and the suffocating politics of downtown Denver, this cabin represented freedom. I'd finally have a place where I could write the novel I'd been putting off, where I could fish at dawn without checking my phone, where the only deadline that mattered was sunset. The property was bordered on 3 sides by a beautiful split-rail fence that Grandpa had installed in the 70s. It wasn't tall or imposing, just a classic ranch-style fence that marked the property lines and gave the whole place a rustic, welcoming feel. The fence was in perfect condition because Grandpa had been meticulous about maintenance. Every spring, he'd walk the perimeter, replacing any weathered rails and treating the wood to preserve it against the mountain weather. For the first 6 months after I inherited the cabin, life was everything I'd hoped for. I spent weekends there year-round and took my vacation time in the summer to stay for weeks at a time. I'd wake up to the sound of loons calling across the water, spend my days hiking the trails that wound through the surrounding forest, and my evenings on the dock with a book and a cold beer, watching the sun paint the sky in impossible shades of orange and pink. The neighbors were friendly but respectful of boundaries, exactly the way mountain folk should be. There was old Bill Henderson, a retired park ranger who lived about a quarter mile down the shoreline and always waved when he paddled his canoe past my dock. The Yamamoto family had a small summer place to the north, and their kids were polite and never left trash on the beach. I thought I'd found paradise. I should have known it was too good to last. The trouble started in my second summer when I got a notice in the mail that stopped my heart. The letter was printed on expensive letterhead: Harmony Lake Estates, Homeowners Association, and signed by someone named Margaret Whitmore, president. I read that letter 3 times before the words sank in. Apparently, my little slice of heaven had been incorporated into a homeowners association while I was grieving my grandfather's passing and dealing with probate. The letter informed me that as a valued member of the community, I was now subject to all HOA rules and regulations, which were attached as a thick packet of single-spaced legal text. My hands were shaking as I flipped through page after page of restrictions. No signs except approved address markers. No vehicles parked on lawns. No alterations to exterior appearance without written approval. No fences except those that meet specific HOA standards for height, materials, and placement. That last rule hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather's beautiful split-rail fence, the fence he'd installed with his own hands, the fence that had weathered 40-plus years of mountain storms, the fence that was as much a part of the property's character as the cabin itself apparently didn't meet the new HOA standards. I called the number on the letterhead immediately, my heart pounding with indignation and disbelief. A woman answered on the second ring with a voice that could have cut glass. Harmony Lake Estates, HOA, this is Margaret. Hi, this is David Chen. I just received your letter about HOA membership, and I think there's been some mistake. My property at 847 Lakeshore Drive has never been part of any homeowners association. The pause that followed was long enough to make me check if the call had dropped. Mr. Chen, she finally said, and I could hear the condescending smile in her voice. I'm afraid you're mistaken. Your property was incorporated into our association when the majority of lakefront owners voted to establish protective covenants for our community. This happened 6 months ago, and all property owners were properly notified. I was never notified of any vote, I said, trying to keep my voice level. My grandfather owned this property for 60 years and— Your grandfather is deceased, Mr. Chen. Her words were sharp and cold. The property changed hands, which triggered the inclusion clause. I have all the paperwork right here. I felt like I was drowning. But the fence will need to be removed or brought into compliance within 30 days. Our standards require wrought iron or vinyl fencing only, minimum 6 feet in height, with approved color schemes. I'm sure you understand that we have to maintain property values for everyone. The call ended with her promising to mail me the official compliance notice and the approved contractor list. I sat on my grandfather's front porch for an hour afterward, staring at that beautiful fence and feeling like the world had shifted beneath my feet. That night, I drove to the nearest town and found a small diner with Wi-Fi. I spent 3 hours researching Margaret Whitmore and this HOA that had apparently swallowed my property without my knowledge. What I found made my blood run cold. Margaret had moved to the lake area 5 years earlier, buying up the largest and most expensive property on the North Shore, a sprawling modern monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a Beverly Hills subdivision, not nestled among century-old pines. According to property records, she'd paid cash nearly $2 million. But it was the newspaper articles that really told the story. Margaret had previously lived in 3 different states, and in each location, she'd eventually ended up in legal battles with neighbors or local authorities. In Arizona, she'd sued a neighbor for planting roses that allegedly attracted bees to her property. In Montana, she'd attempted to have a public hiking trail rerouted because it passed within view of her bedroom window. In California, she'd been involved in a 2-year court battle over the height of a neighbor's eucalyptus trees. The pattern was always the same. Margaret would move to a beautiful, peaceful area, then systematically work to control everything around her. She was like a cancer that spread through communities, turning neighbors against each other and destroying the very qualities that made these places special. Now she'd set her sights on Lake Harmony, and somehow I'd become her first target. The official compliance notice arrived exactly 1 week later, delivered by certified mail to make sure I couldn't claim I'd never received it. The language was formal and threatening, giving me 30 days to bring the subject fence into compliance with HOA standards or remove it entirely. Failure to comply would result in daily fines starting at $50 and increasing by $25 each day until the violation was corrected. I called every lawyer in 3 counties, but the story was always the same. The HOA incorporation had been done legally, if not ethically. Margaret had somehow convinced a majority of lakefront property owners to vote for the establishment of protective covenants, and my grandfather's death had triggered an automatic inclusion clause for inherited properties. Fighting it would cost more money than I had, and even then, the lawyers couldn't guarantee success. The fence had to go, or I'd be bankrupted by fines. But as I stood there, looking at that fence, thinking about my grandfather's hands placing each rail, remembering the pride in his voice when he'd shown it to me as a boy, I made a decision that would change everything. Margaret Whitmore wanted a war? She was about to get one. I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could about HOA law, property rights, and historical land use in Colorado. What I discovered was that while Margaret's HOA incorporation was technically legal, it existed in a gray area that might be challengeable under the right circumstances. The key was in the original homestead records. My grandfather's property was one of the oldest continuous family holdings on the lake, dating back to 1962. If I could prove that certain grandfather clauses or historical designations protected the property, I might have a case. I decided to buy myself some time by requesting a hearing before the HOA board. According to their bylaws, any homeowner facing violations had the right to present their case before enforcement action began. It wasn't much, but it would give me 30 more days to build my defense. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening at Margaret's house, which should have been my first red flag. A legitimate HOA board would meet in a neutral location, a community center, a library, somewhere that belonged to all residents. But Margaret had designated her own living room as the official meeting space, which told me everything I need to know about how she viewed her role as president. I arrived at Margaret's house 15 minutes early, hoping to get a sense of the other board members before the hearing began. The house was even more imposing up close, a massive stone and timber structure that looked like it had been airlifted from an upscale ski resort. It dominated the shoreline with its oversized windows and pretentious architecture, completely out of scale with the modest cabins and summer homes that had defined the lake's character for decades. Margaret answered the door herself, and I got my first look at the woman who was trying to destroy my peace. She was probably in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in the kind of casual clothing that cost more than most people's car payments. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes evaluated me like I was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Mr. Chen," she said without warmth, "you're early." "I wanted to make sure I understood the process," I replied, forcing myself to be polite. "This is my first HOA hearing." She led me into a living room that belonged in an interior design magazine. Everything was white and beige and perfectly coordinated, without a single personal touch or sign that actual humans lived there. The entire back wall was floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, and I had to admit the view was spectacular. "The other board members will be here shortly," Margaret said, gesturing toward a chair positioned directly across from a long white sofa. The setup was clearly designed to make me feel like I was facing a tribunal. "How many board members are there?" I asked. "3. Myself as president, Eleanor Vance as secretary, and Robert Stern as treasurer." She settled onto the sofa and pulled out a thick folder. "I should mention that Eleanor and Robert both have concerns about the precedent your situation might set for the community." Before I could ask what she meant by that, the doorbell rang. Margaret disappeared to answer it, and I heard hushed conversations in the hallway. A few minutes later, she returned with 2 other people who looked exactly like I'd expected. Eleanor Vance was a thin, nervous-looking woman in her 70s who kept glancing at Margaret before speaking, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Robert Stern was a heavy-set man with a carefully groomed beard who had the demeanor of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in his life. The hearing itself was a farce from the beginning. Margaret presented her case with the efficiency of a prosecutor, complete with photographs of my fence, copies of the HOA standards, and a detailed breakdown of how my non-compliant structure was negatively impacting property values for the entire community. When it was my turn to speak, I presented the historical argument I'd been developing. I explained that my grandfather had installed the fence 40 years before any HOA existed, that it was in perfect condition, and actually enhanced the rustic character that drew people to the lake in the first place, and that forcing longtime residents to conform to new standards was exactly the kind of heavy-handed overreach that destroyed communities. I thought I was making a good case. Robert Stern was nodding along, and Eleanor actually smiled when I talked about preserving the lake's traditional character. For a moment, I felt hopeful. Then Margaret started talking, and I realized I'd walked into an ambush. "Mr. Chen," she said, opening a new folder, "I appreciate your emotional attachment to this fence. But what you haven't mentioned is that this isn't really about preserving tradition, is it? This is about money." She pulled out a sheet of paper and slid it across the coffee table toward me. It was a printout from a real estate website showing comparable properties on the lake. Properties with modern, compliant fencing are selling for an average of $30,000 more than those with old ranch fencing, she continued. Your insistence on keeping this outdated structure isn't just affecting your property value, it's dragging down values for everyone on the lake. I stared at the paper, trying to process what she was saying. You're making this about money? I thought HOAs were supposed to preserve community character. We're supposed to protect our investment, Robert said, speaking for the first time. Some of us have our life savings tied up in these properties. And some of us, Eleanor added quietly, have been watching property values stagnate while other lake communities see steady appreciation. I felt like I was in the twilight zone. So you want me to spend thousands of dollars replacing a perfectly good fence so that your house might theoretically be worth more money? It's not theoretical, Margaret said. I have data from 3 different appraisers. Would you like to see it? That's when I realized this whole hearing was theater. Margaret hadn't spent weeks researching property values and hiring appraisers because she was concerned about my grandfather's fence. She'd done it because she'd already decided what the outcome would be, and she was building a legal record to support it. The vote was unanimous. I had 30 days to replace the fence or face daily fines starting at $50. As I walked back to my truck, Eleanor caught up with me in the driveway. "David," she said, glancing back at the house to make sure Margaret wasn't watching, "I'm sorry about this." "I really am." "But Margaret," "well, she can make life very difficult for people who don't go along with her plans." "What do you mean?" Eleanor looked genuinely frightened. She's very thorough when she wants to get rid of someone. Very creative about finding violations and building cases. It's easier to just do what she wants. She hurried back toward the house, leaving me standing in the driveway with a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just about a fence. This was about Margaret establishing dominance, and I was her test case. If she could force me to tear down my grandfather's fence, she could force anyone to do anything. The harassment started 3 days later. I was at the cabin for the weekend, trying to enjoy what might be my last few weeks with the fence intact, when I heard heavy footsteps on my front porch. I opened the door to find Margaret standing there with a clipboard and a camera, dressed like she was conducting some kind of official inspection. "Mr. Chen," she said without preamble, "I'm here to document additional code violations." "Additional violations? What are you talking about?" She started walking around the perimeter of my cabin, taking photographs and making notes. "Your dock extends beyond the permitted 15 feet into the lake. Your cabin's exterior stain doesn't match approved color schemes. And this," she gestured toward a small storage shed that my grandfather had built to house lawn equipment. "This structure was never properly permitted." I watched in stunned silence as she documented every aspect of my property that didn't meet her newly established standards. The dock that had been there for 30 years was suddenly 6 inches too long. The natural cedar stain that had weathered to a beautiful silver gray was no longer an approved color. The storage shed that had been grandfathered under county regulations was now a violation because it lacked an HOA permit that hadn't existed when it was built. "Margaret," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "what are you doing?" She looked up from her clipboard with an expression of fake innocence. "I'm protecting our community standards, David. When one property owner refuses to comply with reasonable requests, it forces us to be more thorough in our oversight. This is harassment. This is enforcement. You'll receive official notices for each violation within the week. I suggest you start making plans to address them promptly." She walked back to her car, leaving me standing on my porch, feeling like I'd been sucker punched. The notices arrived exactly as promised. 5 separate violations, each carrying the same escalating fine structure as the fence. If I didn't address every single issue within 30 days, I'd be facing more than $300 per day in penalties. I called Eleanor that night, hoping she might offer some insight into Margaret's strategy. "Oh, David," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. She did the same thing to the Hendersons when they tried to fight the boat dock restrictions, and to the Wilson family when they questioned the tree removal policy. What happened to them? The Hendersons sold their place and moved to Idaho. The Wilsons declared bankruptcy and lost their cabin to foreclosure. She paused. Margaret bought both properties at auction. She owns 5 lots on the lake now. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about Margaret systematically forcing out longtime residents so she could buy their properties at distressed prices. I was just the latest target in her master plan to own the entire lake. That night, I sat on my grandfather's dock and tried to figure out my options. I could give in and spend $20,000 bringing everything into compliance, which would drain my savings and probably not be the end of Margaret's demands. I could fight it in court and risk losing everything in legal fees. Or I could sell the cabin and let Margaret win. As I sat there watching the moon rise over the water, I thought about my grandfather and all of the summers we'd spent here together. He taught me to fish from this dock, told me stories about the old days when the lake was wild and free, shared his dreams of keeping this place in the family forever. I couldn't let Margaret destroy that. There had to be another way. That's when I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. The moon's reflection on the lake showed the natural boundaries of my property extending well out into the water. According to the original deed, my grandfather's land grant included riparian rights to the natural shoreline and adjacent waters. I'd always assumed that was just legal language about having access to the lake. But looking at it now, with Margaret's threats hanging over my head, I started to wonder if those rights might be more extensive than I'd realized. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse to pull the original land records for my property. What I found there would change everything, but not in the way I expected. And Margaret Whitmore was about to discover that some battles have consequences she never saw coming. The Larimer County Courthouse was a maze of basements and back offices where the real history of our community lay buried in filing cabinets and deed books that hadn't been digitized. I spent my first morning there getting bounced between departments before finally finding Martha Rodriguez, a clerk who'd worked there for 30 years and actually knew where everything was kept. "Riparian rights?" she said, looking up from the deed copy I'd brought. "Oh, honey, you're talking about water law, and that's a whole different animal. Most people don't even know what they own when it comes to lakefront property." She led me down to the basement archives, where rows of metal shelving held bound volumes of property records dating back to territorial days. The air smelled like old paper and mildew, and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously over decades of Colorado history. Your grandfather's original homestead claim is in here somewhere, Martha said, running her finger along spine labels. 1962, you said? That would be here. She pulled out a thick volume and flipped through pages of handwritten entries until she found what we were looking for. The original land grant for my grandfather's property was written in formal legal language, but the important part was clear, including riparian rights to adjacent waters and submerged lands as defined by natural boundaries and historical usage patterns. What does that actually mean? I asked. Martha smiled. It means your grandfather didn't just buy the land up to the water's edge. He bought the lake bottom under his shoreline, and the water above it out to what they call the thread of navigations, basically the deepest part of the lake. I stared at the document, trying to process this information. So I own part of the actual lake? You own the water, the lake bottom, and everything in between, out to the navigation line. Most people don't realize it, but lakefront property in Colorado often includes these underwater rights, especially for older homesteads. She pointed to a hand-drawn map attached to the deed. See this dotted line? That shows your underwater boundary. Looks like it extends about 200 feet from your shoreline. My heart started racing. If I owned the lake bottom extending 200 feet from my property, then Margaret's complaints about my dock being too long were meaningless. You can't violate setback requirements on your own underwater land. But Martha wasn't finished. There's something else you should know about riparian rights in Colorado. They come with certain protections under state law protections that override local zoning and HOA restrictions. She pulled out another book, this one filled with state statutes and court decisions. Colorado water law is based on the doctrine of prior appropriation first in time, first in right. Your grandfather's 1962 claim gives you senior water rights that predate any HOA by decades. I felt like I was discovering buried treasure. So the HOA can't force me to change anything that affects my water rights? Not just that, Martha said, flipping to a section highlighted with yellow tabs. State law requires that any changes to riparian property maintain historical usage patterns unless the owner consents. That includes structures, landscaping, and access patterns that were established before competing claims. She showed me a court case from 1987 where a lakefront property owner had successfully fought a city ordinance requiring dock modifications. The court ruled that municipal governments, and by extension, HOAs, couldn't impose restrictions that materially interfered with established riparian rights without just compensation. Your grandfather's fence, Martha continued, if it was installed as part of the original property development, would be considered part of the historical usage pattern. Same with your dock, your cabin's stain color, that storage shed anything that was there before the HOA existed. I spent the rest of that day copying documents and taking photographs of every relevant page in those record books. By the time I left the courthouse, I had a banker's box full of evidence that might completely change the legal landscape of my fight with Margaret. But the most important discovery was yet to come. That evening, I was organizing the documents in my cabin when I found something that made me stop cold. Attached to one of the historical surveys was a hand-drawn map showing not just my property boundaries, but the boundaries of all the original homestead claims around the lake. According to this 1962 survey, the lake itself was much smaller than it appeared today. What I was looking at wasn't a natural lake at all. It was a dammed reservoir that had been expanded sometime after my grandfather's original claim. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down to my dock, comparing the old survey to the current shoreline. The original lake had been maybe half the size of the current body of water. Everything beyond the dotted line on my grandfather's deed, including the water in front of Margaret's property, had been added later. The implications hit me like a lightning bolt. If Margaret's property was built on what had originally been dry land above the natural lake level, then her lakefront access wasn't based on riparian rights at all. It was based on an artificial expansion of the reservoir. I drove back to town the next morning and found Martha just opening up the courthouse. "I need to see dam permits and water district records," I told her, probably sounding slightly manic. Specifically, anything about Lake Harmony being expanded or modified. Martha raised an eyebrow, but led me back to the archives. That would be in the Water District files. Lake Harmony is managed by the Northern Colorado Water Authority, and they keep records of all modifications. The Water District files told a fascinating story. Lake Harmony had indeed been a smaller natural lake until 1978, when the Water Authority received federal grants to expand recreational opportunities in the area. They'd built a new dam and raised the water level by 15 feet, flooding several acres of previously dry land around the original shoreline. The expansion had required environmental impact studies, property assessments, and compensation for affected landowners. But here's where it got interesting. The compensation was only paid to owners who lost dry land to the flooding. Owners like my grandfather, whose property extended into the original lake, actually gained underwater area without losing anything. According to the Water District's records, Margaret's property was purchased in 2018 for $1.9 million. But the land it sat on had been underwater from 1978 until 2003, when the Water Authority had sold off some flooded lots during a drought period when the lake level dropped temporarily. Margaret wasn't a riparian landowner with historical water rights. She was a speculator who'd bought artificially created lakefront property that had been underwater for 25 years. I spent the next week diving deeper into water law and HOA regulations, consulting with a property rights attorney in Denver who specialized in riparian disputes. What I learned gave me the foundation for a legal strategy that would turn Margaret's own tactics against her. Colorado state law was very clear about riparian rights and their protection from local interference. But it was also clear about the difference between natural riparian rights and artificial lakefront access created by government water projects. My grandfather's 1962 homestead claim gave me senior water rights that predated the dam expansion, the HOA incorporation, and Margaret's property purchase by decades. Under Colorado's prior appropriation doctrine, my rights took legal precedence over any competing claims or restrictions. But Margaret's property, built on formerly underwater land, had no historical riparian rights at all. Her lakefront access was entirely dependent on the Water Authority's continued maintenance of the artificial water level and the government permits that allowed development on previously flooded land. I was sitting on a legal nuclear weapon, and Margaret had just handed me the detonator by trying to force me off my property. The attorney I consulted, Rebecca Torres, was fascinated by the case. "I've never seen a riparian rights dispute quite like this," she said, reviewing the documents I'd assembled. "You're not just fighting an HOA overreach, you're challenging the entire legal basis for half the development around that lake." "What do you mean?" "If your property has senior water rights that predate the dam expansion, and if the HOA is interfering with those rights, then you have grounds for both a civil rights violation and a taking claim under state law. But more importantly, you might have standing to challenge the water permits that allow development on the artificially flooded land." Rebecca explained that water rights in Colorado were considered property rights protected by the state constitution. Any government entity, including an HOA, exercising quasi-governmental authority that interfered with established water rights could be liable for just compensation under eminent domain law. Your fence, your dock, your cabin modifications, if they're part of the historical usage pattern associated with your water rights, then the HOA can't touch them without paying you fair market value for the taking. She paused and looked at me seriously. "But David, this goes both ways. If you push this case, You're going to be challenging the legal basis for millions of dollars in lakefront development. Margaret and her neighbors might fight back hard. I thought about my grandfather, about the summers we'd spent together at the cabin, about the promises I'd made to myself about preserving his legacy. Margaret had started this fight by trying to destroy something that represented 60 years of family history. Now I had the legal tools to finish it. How hard can they fight? I asked. Rebecca smiled grimly. Let's find out. The next day, I sent Margaret a certified letter that would change everything. Instead of appealing her HOA violations, I was notifying her that her association's actions constituted illegal interference with my federally protected water rights, and that I was prepared to seek injunctive relief and monetary damages under state civil rights law. But that wasn't the best part. The best part was the second paragraph, where I informed her that as the holder of senior riparian rights to Lake Harmony, I was exercising my historical water usage privileges to modify my shoreline in a manner consistent with the original 1962 homestead claim. I was going to build a moat, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop me. Margaret's response to my letter arrived within 48 hours, delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The legal document was 12 pages of threats, accusations, and demands that I immediately cease all frivolous legal posturing and comply with the outstanding HOA violations. But what really told me I'd hit a nerve was the emergency HOA meeting she called for that same weekend. According to the notice, the board would be discussing escalating legal threats against the community and considering protective measures to ensure compliance with established standards. I almost didn't go. My attorney had advised me that anything I said could be used against me in court, and that these kinds of meetings were usually designed to create evidence for the HOA's legal file. But I was curious to see how Margaret would spin this to the other residents, and I wanted to gauge whether I had any support in the community. The meeting was held at the small community center near the lake's boat launch, the first time Margaret had agreed to a neutral venue. When I arrived, I was surprised to find nearly 30 people there, representing almost every property around the lake. I recognized some faces from my weekend visits. Old Bill Henderson was there, looking uncomfortable in a folding chair near the back. The Yamamoto family sat together near the front, whispering quietly in Japanese. There were several couples I'd never seen before, probably the newer residents who'd bought into Margaret's vision of an upscale lakefront community. Margaret stood at the front of the room with a flip chart and a laser pointer, looking like a corporate executive giving a presentation to the board of directors. She'd dressed the part 2 navy blue suit, pearls, the kind of outfit that projected authority and competence. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began. I know many of you have concerns about the situation with Mr. Chen's property, and I want to make sure everyone has accurate information about what we're dealing with. She flipped to the first chart, which showed a timeline of events, starting with my inheritance of the cabin and ending with what she called my escalating resistance to reasonable community standards. As you can see, Margaret continued, Mr. Chen has consistently refused to comply with the protective covenants that we all voted to establish. When the board attempted to work with him on a reasonable timeline for bringing his property into compliance, he responded with legal threats and accusations of harassment. She clicked to the next chart, which showed photographs of my property with bright red arrows pointing to every alleged violation. The images were clearly taken with a telephoto lens from her property, and seeing my cabin displayed like evidence in a criminal case made my skin crawl. But what's most concerning, Margaret said, her voice taking on a tone of grave concern, is Mr. Chen's recent claim that he has some kind of special rights that exempt him from following the same rules as everyone else. A murmur went through the room. I could see people turning to look at me, and not all the expressions were friendly. Now, Margaret continued, I'm not a lawyer, but I've consulted with our HOA attorney, and he's assured me that no individual property owner has the right to ignore community standards based on historical claims, or water rights, or any other legal theory. She flipped to a new chart showing property values over the past 5 years. What Mr. Chen doesn't seem to understand is that his refusal to maintain his property affects all of us. Properties in HOA communities appreciate an average of 12% faster than non-HOA properties. That's real money in your pocket money that Mr. Chen is threatening with his stubborn refusal to be a good neighbor. I felt my face getting hot. Margaret was presenting a completely distorted version of events, painting me as a selfish troublemaker who was threatening everyone's investment out of spite.